The Korean Miracle, 1962 to 1980. Abstract.
Among all the newly industrializing countries, South Korea's development strategies, as implemented during the period of export-driven industrialization, 1962 to 80, stand out as a model case in which rapid industrialization has been achieved by means of articulate trade and industrial policies. This paper, taking the historical perspective, critically examines the country's industrial policies and their consequences in development. The analysis focuses on the framework of strategies, the methods and policy instruments, and the implementation aspects of policies formulated. The discussions relate to sector-targeted policy measures as well as macroeconomic policies in the fields of foreign trade, foreign investment, financing and credit, public and private sectors, and technological development. The paper concludes with an overall evaluation of the efficacy and limitations of Korea's industrialization strategies. In particular, it addresses the issue of replicability to other countries by placing their lessons in a proper historical, socio-cultural perspective.
Introduction.
South Korea's rags-to-riches development is often cited as a man-made miracle. It is a miracle in the sense that in the span of the past 3 decades, the country could achieve the kind of structural transformation, from a subsistence, agrarian economy to a modern industrial power, that today's industrialized countries took almost a century to achieve. The transformation was, moreover, achieved with a degree of relatively equitable income distribution by international standards. South Korea, up to well into the 1960s, truly represented a backward, desolate economy based on subsistence agriculture with all the difficulties facing a typical developing country today. The area is about the size of the state of Indiana, and unlike the northern part of the peninsula, South Korea, referred to hereafter as Korea, is poor in natural resources. Only about 30% of the land area is cultivable, and the arable land per farm household ranks among the lowest in the world, currently less than a hectare. Korean society was traditional, feudalistic, agrarian, and isolated from the West until the late 19th century. Japanese colonial rule during the period 1910 to 1945 brought both exploitation and modernization, influencing the country's future course of development. The small infrastructural base built during Japanese rule was mostly destroyed during the Korean War of 1950–53. The country's per capita income in the early 1960s was lower than those of Haiti, Ethiopia, and Yemen, and about 40% below India's. With such a low-level income, domestic savings were negligible. The population growth of nearly 3% a year in an already densely populated country meant that the country had to depend on foreign aid for sheer survival. Unemployment, underemployment, and poverty were widespread, with over 40% of the nation's population suffering from absolute poverty. If ever there was an economic basket case, Korea of the 1950s was it. Capitalism during the 1950s had done little for South Korea. The country today, with some 42 million population and per capita income of nearly $5,000 in 1990, is the world's 12th largest trading nation, and is on the threshold of joining the ranks of industrialized, developed nations. The government-led, outward-oriented economic strategy worked satisfactorily until recently, resulting not only in rapid growth but also in gradual eradication of absolute poverty. The nation's unemployment rate is currently around 3%, and the incidence of absolute poverty is below 5% of the nation's population. From the historical perspective of policy evolution, the post-Korean War era can be distinguished into 3 phases. Import substitution 1954–1960, outward orientation 1961–1979, and balance and stabilization post–1980. Distinct sets of policy goals and instruments can be identified for each phase. First, import substitution policies in the wake of the Korean War 1950–53 resulted in a lackluster growth performance. This period, however, was devoted to the building of physical and human capital infrastructures that served as the basis for subsequent industrial development. The second phase of export-based industrialization started with Park's military regime in 1961. For the ensuing 20 years, the state-guided strategy of industrialization through the development of a powerful export machine worked well. That Korea's development strategy in the second phase placed emphasis on export expansion can be seen from Table 1-1, which disaggregates the contributions of different sources of demand to the country's economic growth. Frank, Kim, and Westphal, in a study based on Chenery Shishido Watanabe's input-output disaggregation method, find that throughout the 1950s import substitution contributed about twice as much as export expansion to GDP growth. During the 1963-73 period, export expansion in relation to import substitution made a more than threefold contribution. However, as Kim and Romer point out, prior import substitution had created possibilities of improved utilization of capital for export expansion in subsequent periods. Thus, a sizable portion of the contribution of the export promotion policies of the 1960s to GDP can be attributed to prior import substitution. Nevertheless, attention must be drawn to the fact that markets for import substitutable products were already saturated in Korea by the end of the decade. The shift toward export expansion in the early 60s was indeed both a timely and logical move in terms of the evolution of Korea's development strategy. Toward the end of the 1970s, however, the Korean economy had overextended itself, and structural imbalances and bottlenecks brought about by the rapid growth policy of the past 2 decades were beginning to manifest themselves. The high rate of growth led to a rapid buildup of foreign debt and stimulated inflation, with widening disparities within industry as well as between rural and urban sectors. Then came the assassination of President Park in 1979 and the resulting power struggle, followed by the oil-induced worldwide recession in 1980-1981 and the crop failure. As inflation became rampant in a stagnant economy, the government had to impose a stabilization program, at the same time strengthening programs for structural adjustment aimed at the restoration of a balanced, stabilized growth path because of the deepening structural distortions and imbalances in the economy. Thus, coming to the 1980s, the government started removing subsidies and preferential policy loans, gradually shifting policy concerns to the problem of making rapid growth more harmonious and less wasteful. The new path in development strategy during the decade of the 1980s called for an efficient allocation of investment to allow industries to develop more in line with the shifting comparative advantages in the world market, while at the same time emphasizing the need for welfare-oriented social development. As the economy grows in size and complexity, the government's role in picking the winners must change to that of a referee in a competitive market. This essay provides an overview of Korea's policies and practice and their consequences in industrial development during the 1962-80 period. This was the period of neo-mercantilistic state intervention within a market-oriented framework. The role of the state was to mobilize and allocate the nation's resources to enhance national wealth and industrial strength, and to direct private sector activity to this end. The goal of the state was not directed toward regulatory welfarism as in the advanced capitalist countries, nor was it meant to achieve egalitarian redistribution as in classic Marxism. The closest historical parallels, although far from being exact, might be the developmental state of Bismarck's Germany or Meiji's Japan in the late 19th century. The focus of this essay on the development during the 1962-80 period is intentional. As a successful case of the newly industrializing economies, Korea's experiences during this period of development can be of use in those developing countries aspiring to industrialize. The organization of this essay is as follows. The next section highlights the evolution of development strategy in terms of goals and policy instruments. Section 3 examines government policy as applied to specific areas in Korea's industrial development. Section 4 discusses the methods and efficacy of policy implementation. The last section concludes with an evaluative summary of Korea's industrial policy along with the lessons to be learnt for other industrializing countries.
Chapter 3. General Synthesis. Policy Aims and Frameworks.
The Korean experience in trade and development contradicts in many ways the traditional argument for free trade. The conventional argument, based on the principle of comparative advantage, emphasizes the benefits from free trade by engaging in those activities for which the country is best suited in terms of resource endowment. In particular, differences in factor endowments should determine the patterns of comparative advantage. A labor-abundant country will have a comparative advantage in labor-intensive goods relative to a capital-rich country. When Park Geun-hye was installed in power in 1961, his policymakers, learning from neighboring Japan's experience, saw the need to build a solid industrial base as the cornerstone of Korea's future development. The long-run strategy favored diversification into manufactured exports. To pursue the policy objective for industrialization, it was felt necessary that the state, given the initial weakness of the private sector, had to play a leading role in formulating and implementing trade and industrial policies. The basic strategy to develop industry called for targeting a few sectors of the economy that were expected to perform well in international markets. Those firms entering them would be granted special incentives, which will be discussed in more detail later. In Figure 3-1, the philosophy underlying Korea's earlier development strategy is illustrated using Eatwell type of cumulative causation framework. The diagram shows the link between world demand and domestic output for a small, open economy. The world demand in the upper box determines the level of national output. The unit cost of industrial output is affected by the level of output, given the presence of scale economies in manufacture. Namely, the greater the level of output, the lower the unit cost of production. Thus, the initial level of exports determines the country's international competitiveness, which in turn influences the rate of growth in world demand. A virtuous circle becomes complete. The more the country sells abroad, the easier to sell. The opposite vicious circle is also possible. If the country loses the initial share of the world market, the domestic output level shrinks, riding upward on the cost curve. The rise in the unit cost could adversely affect the country's export competitiveness, resulting in further losses in the market share. State interventions could prove instrumental in maintaining the virtuous circle in motion. If, for example, exports run into difficulties, the government could introduce policy measures to stimulate export demands. Such policies include exchange rate devaluation, export subsidies, or other export incentive systems. If the export sector begins to lose competitive edge in international markets, the government may resort to fiscal or monetary policies to grant special incentives to or even to direct controls over specific sectors or firms. Imports would be confined to sectors complementary to export sector development. Protective trade policies would be necessary to protect the country's balance of payments position. The above model fits fairly close to Korea's development strategy in the decades of the 1960s and the 1970s. It runs counter to the received view of market-oriented development, according to which Korea's industrialization is seen as a case of success on account of changing comparative advantage attained by correct pricing and realistic exchange rate policies. While not denying the important roles played by market-oriented policies, the point to note is that the market system is used, when deemed appropriate and necessary, only as an instrument in achieving national developmental goals. As such, it can explain part of Korea's success. Not surprisingly, there were problems of bureaucratization buttressed to implement policies which often stifled initiatives and blatantly distorted efficiency in resource use. In the earlier years of Korean development, however, it was simpler to get the bureaucracy moving rather than trying to bring into line the weak private sector. There was not much of the private sector to begin with. Broad goals in a development strategy remain political window dressing unless they are actually carried over into specific policies. Specific policies for industrial development in Korea during the period of export expansion can be grouped into two broad categories. The first was the set of macroeconomic policies aimed at influencing the general environment for industrial activities, and the second, the set of policies more directly targeted on the development of specific sectors or industries. If we speak of the setting of the macroeconomic environment, one important objective of Korea's earlier industrial policy was to create an economic environment conducive to efficient resource utilization. There were two aspects of economic policy implemented for this purpose. One aspect of this was government investment in infrastructural development. During the 1960s, the lion's share of public funds went to funds in infrastructural projects, highways, port facilities, electricity, irrigation, transportation, communication, etc. The government and public enterprises accounted for close to 40% of the total domestic investment in the period between 1963 and 1979. Moreover, the industrial composition of government investment reveals that the share of infrastructure projects investment has been steadily rising, reaching as high as 76% of the total public sector investment in the years between 1977–1980. It was these infrastructure and intermediate production support activities that constituted the foundation for strengthening the vertical linkage of production, paving the way for the process of rapid economic growth. A good deal of infrastructural building was undertaken by existing or newly established public enterprises. Government-owned enterprises grew rapidly, increasing from 7% of GDP to 9% during the 1963–1972 period. They were essentially created to serve as industrial infrastructure and to supply inputs to downstream industries. In addition to creating forward linkage effects, they made a substantial contribution to capital formation and technological development. A good example of the success of public enterprises is the Pohang Steel Mill (POSCO), which was constructed in 1973 under Japanese aid. POSCO quickly emerged as a global producer. It has been technologically modern and extremely cost-effective. Its main objective has been to provide low-cost, high-quality products to downstream industries. The cost-effectiveness of this public sector has been a factor contributing to the subsequent development of other downstream industries, such as shipbuilding, construction, automobiles, and machinery. Perhaps more important was the second aspect of policy dealing with the price setting of such key resources as foreign exchange, investment funds, interest rate, transport, and staple grains. The Price Control Act, revised in 1962, empowered the government to control the prices of most staple grains and the rates of public utilities. Given the important role of prices in the overall allocation of resources, extreme care has been exerted to reconcile the economic interests of various social classes. As late as 1966, some 40% of total economic transactions was subject to direct or indirect forms of price control. The first round of general price reform was attempted before the inauguration of the Second Five-Year Development Plan, 1967–1972. The first plan, 6266, largely a rehash of the ideas presented to the previous regime, was prepared in a hurry simply to show the government's seriousness about economic development and to provide a ground for more sophisticated subsequent plans. The new measures included the exchange rate reform of 1964 and the interest rate reform of 1965. The exchange rate reform devalued the won from 130 to 255 per dollar and substantially liberalized exchange controls. The devaluation was based on a study comparing world and domestic prices, with the new rate reflecting the median purchasing power parity in international markets. The interest rate reform of September 1965 doubled the 6-month deposit rate to 24% per annum, a real interest rate of around 11%. Borrowing rates, except for special purposes, were comparably raised. The reform was meant to place a real rate of interest more in line with the prevailing real rate of return on capital, to enable a shift from quantitative credit rationing towards market allocation, and to encourage domestic savings. It was also hoped that higher interest rates would reduce inflation. Both reforms brought key resource prices into line with relative resource scarcities. Since prices must be used to measure the value of resources in uses alternative to those being investigated, adequate resource planning becomes difficult when prices are severely distorted. In this sense, the reforms of 1964 and 1965 were a precondition for meaningful resource planning. But their significance was far greater. For much of planning's positive impact on economic performance came from the reforms. The basic driving force for development in Korea was private sector response to price and non-price incentives. Sustained development in a largely market-oriented economy would be difficult without an adequate price system, taking into account the effects of subsidies, taxes, and quantitative controls that reflected relative resource scarcities. For the sector policy, the basic strategies for attaining the nation's broad economic goals involved decisions over time on the shift in policy support from sector to sector. From a longer-term perspective on the growth process itself, however, a strategy gradually evolved for upgrading the economy by shifting from dependence on relatively labor-intensive light industry to a structure based on heavy and chemical industries. This made perfectly good sense. Korea's original comparative advantage was cheap and diligent labor. It was therefore reasonable for Korea to engage in sectors like textiles, garments, footwear, and simple electronics. As the domestic wage rate rose and more capital was accumulated, it appeared more advantageous by the mid-1970s from the viewpoint of international comparative advantage for Korea to move into more capital-intensive sectors such as steel or petrochemicals. Other developing countries, particularly in Asia, were becoming strong rivals in the export market for traditional, labor-intensive goods. At the same time, the industrialized countries were turning toward increased protection, particularly against traditional exports from the developing countries. This progression reflects the dynamic strategy for industrialization that Korea has been pursuing along a path similar to the one that neighboring Japan was following. To make things easier, Japan was constantly churning out long-term projections and visions for futuristic industries. By the late 1960s, the government began selecting strategic industries which it was willing to back more energetically than others through a series of measures of a general supportive nature. Korea slipped into the practice later known as targeting industry and product that prevailed in the 1970s. This dynamic sequencing more or less reflects the changing pattern of comparative advantage for Korea as her factor endowment conditions also evolve. First, the Electronics Promotion Law in 1969 recognized electronics as a strategic export industry. Comprehensive plans for developing the industry attempted to direct the effort to adapt to the technological changes taking place in the industry worldwide. The government quickly established industrial estates with such suitable infrastructures as KUMI and Masan, and such specialized institutes as the Korea Institute of Electronics Technology, Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, and the Electronics Industries Association of Korea for Research, Adaptation, and Development. In the wake of the plans for the electronics industry, the promotional policy quickly turned to heavy and chemical industries. In 1973, President Park officially initiated the campaign for the creation of a heavy and chemical industry. The strategic branches of the industry included iron and steel, chemicals and petrochemicals, electrical and general machinery. Various projects were included in the third and fourth plans with generous funding of the manufacturers who qualified. The usual support and incentives were provided for those firms that could export, and imports were restricted for those that could supply the domestic market. It seemed that no effort was spared in order to attain the targets. Following the development of heavy and chemical industries, the choice of strategic industries varied over time, ranging from sophisticated electronics to shipbuilding and to automobiles, among others. The support measures were steadily strengthened. Rather than channel funds and adopt projects as opportunities arose spontaneously, an effort was made to direct the economy along the desired path as its development evolved. The task of developing specific strategic sectors, however, was essentially left in the hands of the private sector. The allocation of investment was an important part of policy, but the role of planning was confined to determining where incentives for investment should be given, and to indicating and establishing an appropriate set of incentives that could guide private entrepreneurs to the right decisions. As indicated in the plan documents during the 1970s, the primary goal of planning for industrial priorities was seen as providing incentives to the private sector at a level compatible with resource needs and availabilities. The role of the public sector was, after setting incentives, to respond where desirable to private sector requests for credit, subsidies, and foreign exchange allocation. An important task of planning at this point also consisted in developing capacity for project evaluation and decision-making, at least at the ministerial level. Once the government decided to promote certain strategic industries, all forms of incentives were made available to them. The incentive system geared to the development of a specific sector included such measures as subsidies given through tax exemptions, faster depreciation of necessary equipment, loans and deductions for the import of capital goods, facilities and savings for the import of intermediate goods, arrangements for licensing technologies, differential pricing, or directly beneficial expenditure. quantitative restrictions on imports of goods and capital, on the allocation of investment funds through the banking system, on the use of transport facilities and quantitative targets for exports and overhead investments. These measures were administered within centrally imposed constraints by several ministries, notably Agriculture, Commerce and Industry and Finance, and by special offices such as the National Tax Administration. To recapitulate, in Korea's planning an overall price reform preceded the sectoral development plan. This served as a precondition for rational resource planning at the sectoral and more disaggregated level. Trade reform measures focused on shifting the economy from a strategy of import substitution towards that of export promotion. The financial reform became the classic example of a successful policy of mobilizing resources, stabilizing prices, and promoting investment. In selecting industrial activities classified as having priority, no particular consideration needed to be given to the shadow prices of the factors of production, nor to the resulting sectoral structural distortions. The prevailing exchange rate and interest rates were used in industrial project evaluation without undue concern for excessive distortion that might result from the project. Macro policy measures for liberalization simply provided a setting in which industrial activities could be selected, not on an ad hoc basis but in relation to their relative contribution to the objectives of rational economic use of capital, as well as the generation or saving of foreign exchange.